Where's that date and time thing? What does index mean? I'm new at this thing.
Wait,
Yeah, this is the place.
are you like doing something with those
Here we
cans?
go. Okay, this is an interview with Dad about Pearl Harbor.
Is it rolling?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Pearl Harbor interview, take one.
Okay, why don't we start out with just before Pearl Harbor and talk about when you joined the Navy and why.
Okay.
Get out of here. Okay.
Okay, shoot.
When did you join the Navy, Dad?
In August the 10th, 1939.
And why? Why'd you go
I
into the
wanted to see
Navy?
the world.
How old were you?
Is it exciting
I was
places?
18.
People?
Just barely 18. In fact, I tried to get in when I was 17, but they wouldn't let me in.
Did you finish school or not?
No, I had 10 years in the 10th grade. Finished the 10th grade.
Watch it.
What was your first assignment? Where'd you begin training and everything?
Okay, Great Lakes Naval Training Station was the training area, Great Lakes, Illinois. And after that, I was assigned to the carrier of the Enterprise, first Enterprise.
Where
It was
was?
on the west coast. In fact, it was in Mare Island Naval Shipyard, San Francisco. That's where I had to go to meet it. And I stayed aboard it for, about a year, I guess. And I was assigned to a deck division, which has nothing to do with airplanes. And I wanted to get into, to be an airplane mechanic at the time. So I kept badgering my division officer with requests to be transferred to an aviation division. And he was short-handed. His division was short-handed, so he didn't want to agree to let me go. So he kept stalling me off.
And what were you doing?
I was a seaman, regular seaman, and I was assigned to a boat crew. One of the small boats on the ship. I was part of its crew. And that was my main duties. I was also subject to any deck duties that might involve the ship, such as loading, unloading cargo, tying and untying the ship when it comes into port, those kind of duties. Anyway, I finally, or I should say, a draft came into the ship, which is a request from the Navy for the ship to furnish so many people to fill a draft assignment on another ship. This other ship was short-handed at the time, and they assigned different divisions the requirement of fulfilling this draft. So, in other words, whose ever turn it was in the barrel to furnish these men. And it so happened that my division was one of them, and the division officer felt that this was a good way to kill two birds with one stone. He'd fill the draft and he'd get rid of me. He wouldn't have to be subjected to my request for a transfer anymore.
You kept
So that's
badgering
what he
him
did.
that you wanted to leave? That you wanted to,
Yeah,
and he got tired of seeing your face?
that's what I assumed.
Yeah.
And anyway, next thing you know, I was had a set of orders to go to the Brazel, the USS Brazel, which was a fleet oiler, and it was an old oiler. It was a World War I oiler, actually, a reciprocating engine oiler, which even back then kind of unheard of. The Navy didn't have very many of them. Anyway, so I went to it, and I think it was in Long Beach at the time, so I was transferred to it. Meantime, we made a cruise to Hawaii on the Enterprise before I got off of it, and another one to Washington to see it at Bremerton. But anyway, so I got transferred to the Brazos.
So you'd been to Hawaii before the actual attack?
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah.
Just as a shore duty? I mean, just as a sea
No,
duty or
just part of the ship's
tour?
the ship's
Stop.
tour. Yeah. We didn't stay very long at the time. I think we stayed about a week or so.
So when did you get to Hawaii actually?
Well, I'm
date?
coming to that.
Oh.
Never adjusted for that.
I stayed on the Brazos about 7 or 8 months, as I remember. And of course, on the Brazos, the closest thing to aviation on that ship was the aviation gas it hauled. Other than that, there was nothing on that. But I did manage to put in a course for third-class aviation mech on it, which was pretty hard to do, considering you had to fill practical factors, what the Navy called practical factors. In other words, it was a kind of a practical approach to fulfilling requirements for this rate. And it was hard to do, but I managed to do it. Anyway, I stayed on it and I became the skipper of the captain's gig, which is the personal boat that the captain uses to run back and forth whenever the ship is in port. And
You pitch them in the water anytime?
anyway, I was still trying to get into an aviation activity, and I'd heard of this chief on the ship that was Chief Yeoman, and he was an old-timer. He had about 17 or 18 years in at that time, and he knew everybody back in the Bureau. So I got to talking to him one day and asked him if there was a way that I could be transferred to an aviation activity. And he says, sure. He says, I can fix you right up. And I said, you can? And, sure. And he says, when do you want to go? I said, as soon as I can. He says, I'll have you fixed right up. So before he turned to leave, he says, by the way, he says, could you loan me $20? And of course, that was the last I saw of the $20. But I thought that was money well spent. Anyway, sure enough, about a month later, here comes a set of orders for me to go to NAS Ford Island. And so off I went. But when I got to Ford Island, I was almost in the same boat that I was back on the ship, because they had sent me to the 1st Lieutenant's Division, which is really nothing but housekeeping duties on the Naval Air Station. And under the 1st Lieutenant's Division was the Fire Department. Well, they eventually transferred me into the Fire Department, and that's where I was when the war started. And anyway, the day of the raid, I happened to be on watch that morning. They were pumping aviation fuel onto Ford Island from this ship, the Neosha. And that's the one that was tied up to the dock. And that dock, if you look at a map of Ford Island, is kind of projected out into Battleship Row. And there was one battleship forward of the dock, California, I believe, and all the other battleships were aft of it. The Oklahoma, the West Virginia, the Nevada, the Arizona, and a couple others that I can't recall right now. Anyway, I actually saw the first bomb falling, because I happened to be looking up and see these 3 planes come swooping down onto the southern end of the island, which is the seaplane ramp, the seaplane part of the island.
When you saw that bomb, is that when you knew the island was being attacked?
No, I actually thought they were our own planes, and from the angle that I was looking at, they were far enough away to where it looked like they might have been dropping bombs on the Barber's Point part of the island, part of Oahu, which is off Ford Island, which they sometimes used in bombing practice over there. It's kind of an uninhabited section, was then, of the island. And these 3 planes actually came swooping down, each dropping one bomb. And by the time the first bomb hit, it was shaking the island, and I knew something was wrong with it. And about that time, another plane had come by, and he was machine gunning the dock. And actually machine gunned the dock, started on one end of the dock, and the bullets, just you could see the bullets hitting right aboard the tanker. In fact, the chief that was standing near me got hit in the leg, as I remember. Anyway, I figured it was no time for me to be there on that dock, so I dove down off the dock into the water. And that's where I was when the actual raid was going on. I was scared beyond wits end, you know. And especially when the Arizona blew up, they had a full view of it. And
So where were you, what ship were you by when this happened?
it was by the Neosha.
And how far was that from the Arizona?
No, that was the Neosha, I figured, was about probably close to 200 yards from the dock and the ship. From the Arizona. So, but at that explosion was so violent that it just felt like the end of the world was coming. It was such a terrific explosion. It's just hard to imagine. There was debris raining down for 5 minutes after that ship blew up.
Wow.
All kinds of debris that you couldn't possibly imagine to be aboard a ship. You know, pieces of boilerplate, mattresses, and a lot of gunpowder, unfired gunpowder, which is cylindrical in form, and it's about half as long as a cigarette, and about the same size. And that was just covered the island around in the immediate vicinity. When that bomb blew up inside that ship, it just devastated it. Most of that gunpowder got fired, I suppose, but a lot of it got blown out too without being fired. Anyway, when the first wave had died,
You were still in the water all this time?
yeah, I was still in the water. I got back on the dock and got in my truck and drove back to the firehouse. And we got sent out to fight fires where that first bomb had fallen, because the airplanes were there at Fort Allen, and some of them had started to burn, and others were in imminent danger of being set afire by the other airplanes that were burning. And at that time, during fighting the fire, the USS Shaw blew up in the Navy Yard, which was directly across the channel. And I'd say it's probably 500 or 600 yards away from there.
Mm-hmm.
It was directly across the channel. And that was another terrific explosion, even though that was quite a ways further away, and it didn't, you know, it didn't seem as violent, but it was still a bad explosion. It looked like 4th of July blowing up there. And I just happened to be looking at it at the time. In fact, there's a very famous photo that somebody had taken either slightly before or right after this instant in time, where I saw this shell come being hurled out of its own magazines.
Is it in the book?
No, I don't think so. Maybe it is. I don't know.
I think that's the one that's...
Anyway, I've talked to other people, and nobody else has seen that shell come out. Anyway, the shell comes tumbling end over end, and it looked like it was going to hit the fire truck I was standing beside, but it didn't. It just barely missed the truck, and then it ricocheted off into the hangar, and you could hear it bouncing around inside this
About
hangar.
how big was that shell?
It looked like a 5-inch shell, you know, an unfired projectile, and not a explosive projectile, just a projectile. Anyway, it had been bouncing around in that hangar, but I never found anybody else that had seen that same sight.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, we continued fighting the fire there, and
How long were you in the water?
oh, it's hard to remember that exactly, but I would say probably about 10 minutes maybe.
So you'd gotten out way before the second wave.
Yeah, oh yeah. Mhm.
And you'd
Yeah.
gotten back to the firehouse
And got
before
back
the
to the
second
firehouse
wave.
before the second wave.
Did you go and find one of your commanders to ask what to do and what you were supposed to be
Well,
doing?
went back to the firehouse, and I think the chief there directed us to go to the seaplane ramp.
Why?
Help fight the fires there that were, the airplanes there that were still not on fire were in immediate danger of being put on fire, set on fire. Anyway, I also remember going into the mess hall, and I think that was probably after most of the raids were over with. And just the mess hall was almost completely filled with bodies of people, alive and dead, in all kinds of conditions. Just hard to imagine that a human body could be exposed to so many different conditions. You know, burned, limbs blown off, just covered with oil, and just mutilated.
Mm. Why'd you go into the mess hall?
They were using that as a sick bay. The sick bay was full.
Yeah, but what brought you to the mess hall? Why did you happen to see all
I don't
that?
remember the exact reason. Like I say, I think it was after all the activity had kind of died down, and well, the barracks was in that same building actually, and that's where I lived, in the barracks.
Was it just chaotic? with the-
Entirely chaotic. Well, the whole area, not only the whole air station, but that whole area was just in utter chaos. And there were rumors circulating around that the Japs were coming back at any time, and we were in imminent danger of being invaded, and just total chaos. That
How about the Admiral's house that everybody was stationed there at night? The men were-
Hold on 1 second, I need to change the battery on this.
Sure.
Can we?
What were your feelings during the attack?
Well, of course, we knew then that the Japanese were doing the attacking. In fact, one of these first three planes, or actually the one that was doing the machine gunning, you could actually see that machine gunner in the back seat swiveling his machine gun around, and you could see the meatball on the airplane, so we knew it was Japanese, or at least I did then, which was,
The meatball?
yeah, the red,
Oh, the red circle.
red circle.
Right,
Call it
son next
meatball.
to go.
For a while at the beginning, did you just think it was,
No, only when the first three planes were dropping their bombs,
That's what
I thought that was our own airplanes, because they were far enough away that you couldn't get a good look at them. For me, they were far enough away, and you couldn't tell the markings on the airplanes from where I was at. But that first explosion left no doubt.
did you have any friends there that were with you going through this experience together?
Not immediately. I don't recall anybody actually. I had another man with me on this fire truck. I can't even remember what he looked like at this time. You know. And as far as seeing anybody that I knew personally get wounded or hit, I didn't. Nobody that I knew closely was hurt or wounded. The three waves.
So there was 3?
There was actually 3 waves, as I remember. And the second wave was about 9 o'clock, and the third wave was about, I guess, maybe 9:30, somewhere along in there, as I remember. It was all over by 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock local time. Okay, anything else?
What happened the next day?
Okay, let me regress a little bit. That late afternoon or evening, actually it was evening because it was dark, everybody was in dire fear of being invaded. So everybody was on edge, and everybody was armed to the teeth. They had all the guns out, everybody was waiting. And our own airplanes, which we found out later were ours, were coming in from the Enterprise, my old ship, to land. They had been scheduled to come in. Actually, they were scheduled to come in the day before, and they got delayed because one of the escort destroyers developed some problems, so it delayed the carrier coming in. Anyway, normally they send the airplanes in first before the ship comes in, and they land at whatever station or field that they're going to ahead of the ship. Anyway, this group of airplanes, I don't know how many was in the group, but I would estimate maybe 8 or 9 airplanes, was trying to land on Ford Island. And somebody started shooting, and the whole sky just lit up.
Somebody from the ground?
Somebody from the
Just
ground
thought
started
they-
shooting at
at
one of
our
the
own?
airplanes, at our own airplanes. And I think they knocked down about 3 or 4. I know that a couple of pilots got killed anyway.
Wow.
It was just punchy.
Yeah, they were just so scared, you know, and somebody started shooting and everybody else just followed automatically. And the sky was just lit up. I don't see how any airplane could have got through that mess. The flak was so heavy. In fact, I think some of the people in Honolulu got killed from our own artillery, from our own shells being fired.
From the air or from the ground?
No, from the ground. Because they use, well, Honolulu wasn't very far away. It's only like a matter of 3 or 4 miles from Pearl Harbor. And those shells carry a long ways.
At that time, they didn't have any kind of like radio communications to the other ships that they knew were supposed to be coming in, that they could have warned them in advance.
Well, they
or
did,
anything?
but it did make a difference. You'd have to warn everybody that was manning a gun. And they didn't have that kind of communication there.
Yeah.
So that was almost impossible.
So what, did you stay at the firehouse the rest of that day?
Well, I can't remember where I was at on that 3rd wave. I'm just trying to think of where I was at. I think we were still out. And I do remember that later we came back and we tried to help fish some of the people out of the water around the Arizona. And I know we dragged some people in. We were all covered with oil. And we were trying to assist in anything
Did you do that from a
could.
boat or from the docks or
No,
what?
that was from the land, actually. I never did get in a boat. Everything was from the land that I did.
And then the next day, were you still just
Well, the
waiting?
next
to see-
day everybody was jittery, but things were kind of returning a little bit to normal. And there wasn't anything undue. We were cleaning up and since I was involved with the firehouse, we were doing everything we could in that way, putting out any remaining fires and doing whatever we could.
Did you stay within that general area of the firehouse mostly? You didn't travel around the island?
No, at one time, I do remember going back, well, see where the Arizona was near the quarters.
Yes.
There.
The military dependence quarters.
Oh.
Yeah, and come to think of it, I do remember one incident there that it must have been during the 3rd wave where we were back down at those quarters at Port area. And I can remember there was palm trees there. And you could hear bombs and torpedoes still going off. And whenever you'd hear one of these explosions, you'd hide behind the palm tree. Well, you had about 3 or 4 people trying to hide behind one palm tree. Anyway, you'd hear the explosion off over here, so you'd run around the other side of the palm tree. And you'd hear one over there, and you'd go around back around that side, and that sort of thing.
From those quarters is where the Utah, you can see the Utah.
No, not from those quarters. The Utah was on the other side of the island.
When we went on this trip, we could see that from certain quarters there. the
That's
Utah,
from the quarters on that side of the island.
The officer quarters.
they had some quarters over on that side of the island too. But I'm talking about primarily the quarters that were near the Battleship Row. And that's where the Admiral's quarters were, by the way. It was actually very close in Arizona. They had about, well, you remember the buildings that you did see there with the streets. I'd say maybe 15 or 20 of those houses were there. That was the officers' quarters.
How long did you stay on Pearl Harbor until you were transferred out?
Well, actually I stayed there until about January of '43, and then I got sent back to a Navy school in Chicago.
So you were only there about a month after the attack?
43.
That was December
That's
41.
more
Oh,
than,
okay, a year,
like
a little over a year.
and a half
That's
or
right.
so. Well, a little over a year. See, maybe it was a little later than January. I can't quite remember just when we went there. Anyway, went to the school. That was about a 4-month school in Chicago, and the whole thing, going there and coming back, took about 6 months.
So you went back to Pearl Harbor?
And came back to Pearl Harbor. That's where I was assigned. And,
Different job.
and, oh yes, back in June of '42, I finally made aviation mech while I was in the fire department. So then they had to transfer me to an aviation activity, which was what they called A&R, Assembly and Repair Department. That's where they repaired the airplanes. And that's where I was assigned to from there. And I became a machinist mate. They put me-
On Pearl Harbor?
Yeah. They put me in the machine shop as an apprentice there, and I learned to become a machinist there, an actual machinist. Even though the rating is called aviation machinist mate, that was a general term that they used for any airplane mechanic, anybody that had anything to do with repairing airplanes, from metal engines, airframe, hydraulic systems, etc. From that standpoint, he was called an aviation machinist mate. Later during the war, they came out with specialty ratings, and they branched off into a whole bunch of different categories. They had specialists in hydraulics, specialists in airframe repair, specialists in propellers, specialists in engines, and at that time I was still the aviation machinist mate, but I had gotten sent back to this school in Chicago, and there I went through what they call the instrument school, aviation instruments. And when I came back, they tacked on the specialty rating behind my regular rating.
Well, did you work on the airplanes that were destroyed or bombed?
Oh yes, but that didn't take long to repair, a matter of like a month or two. We either repaired them or scrapped them, one or the other. Anyway, I was assigned to the instrument shop at the Naval Air Station there, which was part of the Assembly and Repair Department. And I eventually made chief there, from third class to second class to first class to chief. And then I was in charge of the instrument shop there until I eventually got transferred from there, and that was in January of '45. I was still there in January of '45.
In Pearl Harbor?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Where'd you go after that?
And I got sent to Naval Air Station, Miami, Opelika. And that's where I was when the war ended.
So you never got sent overseas or anything?
No, actually not.
What, can you think of something that really sticks out in your mind, most memorable thing that happened to you while you were on Pearl Harbor?
Yes, let's see, I was still in the fire department, and I was driving a crash truck, and we stood these crash truck watches at the tower. Remember the tower that we saw there? We used to stand by whenever they had any airplane activity going on the station, so that in case an airplane crashed or something, they'd be ready with the crash truck. Anyway, they were putting some guns in on the north end of the field, which was not too far away from the quarters
Right.
part of the field.
That's fun.
And they were using these tall cranes to lower these guns into position. And one of the airplanes from the Lexington aircraft was taking off. And evidently the pilot didn't see this crane sticking up in the air. And his wing hit that crane just full tilt and just knocked him down, spun him to the ground, and we saw the crash right away. So I and the rest of the crew, there's I think 2 other people part of the crash truck that were on watch. We jumped on this crash truck and cranked it up and took off, going roaring down the end of the field. We got down to, I would say, not more than 50 yards away from where the airplane had actually crashed. And it had depth charges on the wings when it crashed. And evidently, one of the depth charges got fused and it blew up. It just blew up the airplane. Well, in the meantime, before I'd gotten there, there was a bus that was going around the end of the field, and evidently the bus, which was right near the crash site, saw the crash. They stopped the bus, and a bunch of people jumped off the bus and ran down there to try to rescue the crew. Had a pilot and a bombardier in it.
And it was still in the plane?
Yeah, they were still in the plane. And that's when the bomb blew up, or depth charge blew up. And it killed something like 10 people. And I can remember the only thing that was left of the airplane that was any size was the cockpit area with the pilot still in it. And he was still clutching the stick, and all the clothes was burned off him, and his face and hair were all burned off. No hide left on him at all. And the only thing that wasn't burned very badly was where the parachute harness had crossed his chest like that. You could see the white skin still underneath that. The rest of him was just burned horribly. Anyway, it killed both the pilot and the bombardier, as well as I believe it was 10 people in all that died in that incident. Anyway, we were about 50 yards away when it actually blew up. And if I'd have gotten there just a second sooner, we'd have been involved in the crash at least. It seemed like that when it exploded, it just kind of pushed the crash truck back for a brief moment there.
Was this during the first wave?
This was, no,
Or
this
later?
was much later than after the attack. It was in June of '42.
Oh.
Just an accident. Airplane hit the crane that was putting the cannon in place.
Well, how did you feel going back there 50 years later?
Well, certainly brought back a lot of memories. Yeah.
We went on a tour of Ford Island itself, a bus tour.
Yeah, we actually saw the whole island, and it's basically unchanged, except it's in disrepair. The airstrip is overgrown with weeds, and you can hardly recognize it as an airstrip, really.
The firehouse is a post office now.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
But the dock that Dad was on is still there. We have pictures of it.
Oh. And you never found any of your friends or anybody you knew while you were on there?
No, I was really disappointed because I thought perhaps I'd run into somebody that I knew. We had the only other fellow that I knew was with us, and that was Jim Shipstead. He went to Hawaii with us.
But
Actually, he got there a little after we got there, but
You didn't know him till much later.
No, I knew him
You knew
then.
him on
Oh, you
Pearl
did know
Harbor.
him
Yes.
then?
And
Oh.
you've kept up with him over all these years.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
He's the man we visit in Montana when
Yeah.
we come back in Alaska. Yeah. Yeah, I met him at the barracks.
Well, are you glad that you went back to see it?
Yes. Yeah. It was a rewarding experience.
In what way?
Well, it, you know, kind of brought back a lot of memories and a lot of nostalgia.
A lot of changes on that island.
I bet how it's grown.
Well, actually, you know, the buildings and everything haven't really changed too much, with the exception of that hangar where the first bomb was dropped isn't there anymore because I think after the raid it was damaged so badly they tore it down. I don't really remember that part of it. I thought that that hangar was repaired, but it's not there anymore. So I think they took it down.
When were you interviewed for that book, The Day of Infamy?
Oh, I was at Pearl Harbor yet, and I don't remember exactly, but I would say it was, wait a minute, maybe it wasn't while I was still there. I think maybe it was afterwards, after war was over with. I don't remember exactly, but I would say 1946, somewhere along in there.
How did he find you? Or
I think he had sent out some inquiries, and anybody that wanted to could respond to the inquiries, and I did.
did you know you were going to be in it?
No,
Your name was
I
going to be in the
didn't.
book?
No, I don't think he.
Who was the
He
author?
just sent out some inquiries. Walter Lord,
That's right.
and in fact, I never met him. This is all done by mail. He sent out a questionnaire, and I just answered the questionnaire.
Did you get any royalties or anything?
He probably signed his name
As a waiver?
as a waiver.
Yeah,
Yes,
I don't
yeah.
remember it. You know, that's a long time ago, really.
Yeah,
40-some odd years ago.
it is a long time. Well, that's anything, I can't think of anything else to ask.
Did they do a lot of the ship repairing at Pearl Harbor, you know, after the bombing
they
and
did
everything?
all of it?
No, I guess that would make sense if they're
Well,
all
I'll
there.
take that back. There was one or two ships that they repaired enough, maybe more, but at least one or two, that they repaired enough to be sent back to the States for repair. Because there were so many ships that were broken that it just filled up the yard.
I think they sent some back to San Francisco area for repair.
I think so.
How long did it take them to get them, like, to a state where they could actually get them
Not too
somewhere
long,
else?
frankly. I think a matter of months, to where most of them were repaired and ready to go back into action. Yeah, most of them, I think of like 3 or 4 months.
That's quick.
Yeah.
Were you involved in any of the ship repair?
No. No, I was strictly attached to Fort Island, which that was not a ship repair facility. Yeah.
The A&R department that you were attached to later was what, airplane repairs? Or
Yeah,
Oh.
it stands for Assembly and Repair.
of airplanes, not of ships?
Airplanes,
Okay.
only, yes. Oh, I was going to mention to you, the Oklahoma, that was one of the ships that had capsized, and there were people that were trapped inside of that ship. And we assisted in trying to extricate those people that were trapped. And it was really a tedious job because they couldn't use torches. They couldn't use acetylene torches to cut into the hull, which would have been quick to try to get these people out. There was so
Why?
much oil around that they were afraid. And not only that, but it would use up whatever oxygen was still left inside that compartment that they were trying to cut into. So they wound up using things like chipping hammers and actually cutting manually with a hammer and a chisel. So it took a lot of time. There was quite a few people that got trapped in there and they couldn't get them out.
Hmm.
I think the Oklahoma was the next to the Arizona ship as to the highest number of losses. I think he lost something like 400 some odd men on that ship.
Wow.
Well, of course, that included not only the ones that were trapped, but the ones that got killed in the action.
Did you actually help try to chisel away at the metal?
I personally wasn't. I personally didn't. They had enough people there to do that kind of thing, you know, without involving people from the fire department, which they weren't experts at that.
Mm.
But if you look at a map and see where the Oklahoma was moored and where that dock was, you can see that that's like you could throw a rock at it. From where I was at, I could see the torpedoes. I couldn't see the torpedoes actually being fired, but the torpedoes exploding. You see this tall column of water just shoot skyward whenever a torpedo would hit and explode. And in a matter of minutes, the ship was just keeling over like that. And a huge ship like that, it's just hard to imagine the effect that has on seeing something, especially that close.
Did you see it keel over?
Oh yes, I was just like, you know, right there.
Who
That was-
fired the torpedoes?
Who?
I mean,
Those mini subs probably.
No.
No?
Oh, no.
The airplanes in the
Airplanes
attack,
were
they
probably.
dropped
oh, the
torpedoes.
airplanes. Oh.
I was
They're-
thinking it was
No, they
the
drop
mini
bombs
subs.
and
Yeah, I was
torpedoes.
going to ask if there were
Right.
submarines out there or something.
Not in the harbor. Well, there were actually 1 or 2 midget submarines had gotten into the harbor. At least they thought they did. I'm not sure if they actually did or not. But weeks later, they were depth charging suspected submarines in the harbor. Anyway, the airplanes would make their run from the submarine base, where we, that's about where we got on the ferry there, near there. From that angle, you could see a straight shot at the Battleship Row,
Mm.
and just line up there, and they were using specially designed torpedoes that were shallow running torpedoes, because the harbor is so shallow. You couldn't use a in the open sea. You know, they could use torpedoes that would go to a depth, correct depth for a battleship. These, they could only set them like for 3 or 4 feet of water. And anyway, I saw the Oklahoma being hit, I would say 3 times with torpedoes. And that's why it didn't take long for it to keel over. They just ripped it open.
How long did it take the Nevada to maneuver its way out of the harbor so it wouldn't be in the way and wouldn't block?
Well, see, it had actually been in the process of getting underway. It takes quite a while for a ship to get underway from a cold start.
And especially by itself, without the help
Yes, oh yes, in a harbor like that.
of the tugboats.
They're
There's no
normally supposed to have tugs helping it. But a ship, especially the size of a battleship, you have to get the steam up in the boilers, and that takes time, and usually a matter of hours. And this thing managed to get up steam and get underway within a matter of minutes. I don't know how they did it, but during the second wave, it was underway. And
I remember hearing tell how a roar of cheers
yeah,
went up because it did it all by itself as opposed to having all this assistance that it usually needed.
but the fact that it was underway, it seemed like it galvanized all the Japanese pilots to concentrate on it. And they were really giving that ship bombs and torpedoes and machine gun fire on it. Anyway, I understand it was the chief quartermaster on that ship that actually guided the ship. Was actually guiding the ship at the time. And they figured that he didn't want the ship to be sunk in the channel, to block the channel. So he beached it kind of towards the south end Ford Island on the opposite side of the channel.
That was a marvel in itself, that he was able to do that.
Yeah. It was one of the first ships to be put back into service, by the way. The less damaged ships, the lesser damaged ships were the ones that were repaired the quickest. Concentrated on those, put them back into service. The heavily damaged ships were the ones that took longer.
Yeah.
The Arizona was one of the last ones.
Where was the prisoner taken? It was one of the men gave up. Was it a mini sub?
Yeah.
Gave up?
Yeah, that was
He was the first prisoner of war. Where was he picked up?
he was picked up at the entrance to the harbor. That's what I remember. He had some trouble with the submarine, and he was in a process of leaving the submarine and walking under the island.
Yeah.
I think he beached the submarine
That sounds familiar.
near there, and one of the Army's privates, I believe he was a private, maybe he was a second lieutenant at the time, captured him.
Yeah.
He was the first prisoner of war to be taken, and that was actually around 7 o'clock in the morning, before the attack.
Yeah, he had actually hit reef with his submarine and caused the launching of the torpedoes to fail. So he couldn't actually launch the torpedoes. He couldn't do anything.
Mhm.
And because the water was so murky, he couldn't really see where he was going too well. So the only thing he could do was get out.
I remember another mini sub that was retrieved, and the two-man crew that was aboard had committed suicide rather than give up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that.
Well, there were at least one Japanese pilot that did the same thing.
Mhm.
His ship got hit, his airplane got hit by anti-aircraft fire, or anti-aircraft fire, and he saw that he couldn't make it back to his ship. So he just picked the target and dove in on it. One of the first kamikazes, not the first kamikaze of the war. They had a lot of them after that.
If they captured that prisoner of war before the war actually started, how come they didn't suspect something?
Who knows? You know, there was such a lack of communication, really. The group of airplanes that was coming in was spotted on radar, and the guy actually reported them to his superior officer, and he just kind of dismissed them. He thought they were B-17s being flown in from the mainland on their way to the Philippines. And so they just ignored the whole thing. But they actually saw all of them on the radar at about 7 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that's about it.
It's hard to remember everything all at one time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it really is.
I'm sure there are other stories to tell, but they don't all come to mind at once.
Oh yeah, there was that incident that you were talking about earlier where they dropped a bomb right in the middle of the dispensary.
Yes. There was a pattern in the middle of the dispensary, but it didn't go off.
Yeah, it was
made a
either a
crater.
complete dud or at least a partial dud,
Made a big crater.
because it did seem like it exploded, but it was such a weak explosion that all it did was break the glass nearby. Yeah, the dispensary is a rectangular building with a patio right in the middle of it, and it dropped it, not in the center of the patio, but close to it anyway. And all it did was just break some windows, kind of bulge the concrete up around it where it actually fell.
Well, Dad, we appreciate you doing this. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Robert J. Lago-Marcino, on behalf of the Congress of the United States, will present the Congressional Medal for Veterans of the Attack on Pearl Harbor to more than 100 veterans or surviving family members of those who served their country so valiantly on that fateful day in 1941. Before I introduce the members of the official party, I am pleased to acknowledge the presence of many distinguished guests from our neighboring communities of Buellton, Lompoc, Santa Maria, and Solvang, as well as many of Vandenberg's senior officers and their spouses. We very much appreciate your attendance this afternoon. The members of the official party include Mr. Olin Campbell, the president of the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association, Chapter 4. The Vice Commander of the 30th Space Wing, Colonel Alexander A. Abella. The Commander of the 20th Air Force, Brigadier General Thomas E. Kenning, Jr. And our guest of honor, Congressman Robert J. Lago-Marcino of the United States House of Representatives. And now I'm pleased to present your host today, the Vice Commander of the 30th Space Wing, Colonel Bell.
Honored veterans of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Congressman Lago-Marcino, General Kenning, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the men and women of Vandenberg Air Force Base, I welcome you to this presentation of the Congressional Medal for the Veterans of the Attack on Pearl Harbor to an impressive number of such veterans from the Central California area. You honor Vandenberg by your presence here today, and we are grateful to you for allowing us to be a part of this ceremony. The lore of the attack on Pearl Harbor is replete with examples of personal courage and acts of heroism which to this day inspire and enthrall us. Because of the gallantry of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, the tragedy of that Sunday 50 years ago was to serve not as some initial slide to defeat, but as a stepping stone to eventual victory. To the veterans of Pearl Harbor and World War II assembled here today, let me say that we who currently serve in the armed forces of our country have always held you in awe and admiration. You who fought for your country in a war whose outcome would have an impact on the course of human history as profound as any that has ever been waged. The heritage of your example sustains this country's armed forces more than you can ever believe possible. We yearn to be as strong as you, as patriotic, and as successful in protecting and defending the United States of America. You are so much the reason why we swell with pride when we pledge allegiance to our flag or when we hear the strains of our national anthem. The medal presentations to be made today are a most fitting tribute to those heroes whose blood, sweat, and tears assured the survival of our civilization in the face of its worst nightmare. Where would we be today but for your valor? This ceremony is a significant event in the history of this installation. The men and women of Vandenberg are grateful for being given this opportunity to play a part in this tribute to the veterans of Pearl Harbor. To all the veterans of the attack on Pearl Harbor assembled here, we are extremely proud of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Bell. And now it's my privilege to present the Commander of the 20th Air Force, Brigadier General Thomas E. Kenning, Jr.
Honorees, Congressman Lago-Marcino, Colonel Bell, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome again on behalf of all of us in this Strategic Air Command and the men and women of the 20th Air Force. The 20th Air Force is a fighting force that had a large role in winning the war in the Pacific in the years that followed the disaster that took place at Pearl Harbor on that morning in December. We're proud to carry on that tradition today as we stand for and fight for the defense of freedom in our nation today. It's a special privilege for me personally to join Congressman Marcino this morning, or this afternoon, because of the special tie that I believe that I have to a particular hero of the Battle of Pearl Harbor. Prior to coming to Vandenberg, I commanded Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, named in honor of George A. Whiteman, who was the first American airman killed in the Battle of Pearl Harbor. I want to tell you the story of Lieutenant George Whiteman because I think it's symbolic of all the men and women who were at Pearl Harbor and in the surrounding military installations on that day in December. George Whiteman was a young, bright American who could sense that war was coming and looked for a way to serve his nation. He became a fighter pilot and was stationed at Wheeler Air Base with what was acknowledged to be inferior equipment relative to that of what the Japanese had assembled in those years prior to the war. But he was ready to do his job. On December 7th, when the first bombs started falling on Wheeler Field, George Whiteman rushed to get on a uniform, and in his haste he put on his dress uniform, not his flight suit. He went down to the flight line and discovered that the some 80 airplanes at Wheeler Air Base had been destroyed. He jumped into his vehicle and drove the 25 miles as rapidly as he could to Bellows, and there he found one airplane that was being prepared to fly. Several others were also being loaded. He jumped into the cockpit of that airplane, started the engine, and immediately went to take off. Just 50 feet off the ground, two Japanese Zeros came in behind him, and George A. Whiteman was not able to fight that day or any day thereafter. He died defending his nation, giving every ounce of himself to the very end. He was killed that day along with some over 2,000 others of your brothers and sisters who were there doing their job on that morning. I believe this demonstrates the courage that inspired many of you, the survivors, to go on to fight hard, to defend our nation, and more importantly, perhaps, inspires the young men and women that have come these some 50 years afterwards, that have fought to defend this nation in numerous conflicts and in that silent conflict, the Cold War, especially over it. World War II didn't end the challenge to America's freedom. The threats to our freedom still exist today in spite of the massive political change that's taking place in the world. Now today we honor you as the heroes of the past, but really as an inspiration to our warriors of today and to our warriors of the future who will strive to protect this nation and defend our freedoms. It is a deep honor for me to participate today. Thank you.
Thank you, General Kennedy. Our principal speaker this afternoon is currently serving his 9th term in the United States House of Representatives. He was first elected to Congress during a special election in March 1974. He serves on two major committees in the Congress, the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the House Committee for Interior and Insular Affairs, of which he is Vice Chairman. He also serves as Vice Chairman of the Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere Affairs and as Vice Chairman for the Vice Chairman for Parks on the National Parks and Public Lands Subcommittee. In addition, he is Chairman of the Prisoner of War Missing in Action Task Force and Chairman of the National Republican Institute for International Affairs. He is a native of Ventura, California, and served in the United States Navy during World War II. He is a graduate of the University of California at Santa Barbara and the Santa Clara University School of Law. In 1958, he was elected mayor in Ojai, California, and in 1961, he was elected to the California Senate. During his distinguished career in the state Senate, he was the honored recipient of such awards as Legislative Conservationist of the Year, Legislator of the Year, and the Santa Barbara Medal for his quintessential public service. He has authored major legislation on natural resources, trade, foreign affairs, tax reform, governmental efficiency, and the financing of schools. Not incidentally, he was a major force in gaining congressional approval of the Pearl Harbor Survivors Commemorative Medal. He and his wife Norma have 3 children and are anxiously awaiting a 5th grandchild. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to present Congressman Robert J. Lagomarsino.
Thank you, Colonel Ron, Olin, General Kenning, Colonel Bella, men and women of Vandenberg Air Force Base, Pearl Harbor veterans, survivors, and friends. You know, it's indeed an honor for me to be here today on my own behalf and that of the U.S. Congress. You know, I remember very clearly that Sunday, a little over 50 years ago. I was about 15 years old when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, but it was one of the most formative influences of my life. And I can remember it as if it were yesterday, that clearly. And I know that's the case with almost everybody who was alive at that time. The December 7th sneak attack on our sleeping forces, that day of infamy, as Roosevelt so aptly called it, spurred me to try to rush out and enlist, although I was too young. My parents did say they would consent to my enlisting if I finished high school. So I certainly wasn't alone in this. Finished the 2nd semester of high school, and I think it was in 6 weeks, and they did allow me to enlist in the Navy. I asked them if they would let me, if they would sign for the Marine Corps, and they said, no way. They did do it for the Navy, so I did enlist. You know, there are a lot of heroic stories about what happened on that day. The General has told you one. Let me tell you about one of your own here today. Very interesting story. Shortly after that day, on December 16, 1941, a telegram was addressed to Peter W. Reese of 1251 South McBride, Los Angeles, California. The telegram read, "The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you that your son, Gerald Lawrence Reese, coxswain, U.S. Navy, was lost in action in the performance of his duty and in the service of his country. The Department extends to you its sincerest sympathy in your great loss. To prevent possible aid to our enemies, please do not divulge the name of his ship or station. If remains are recovered, they will be interred temporarily in the locality where death occurred, and you will be notified accordingly." Signed, Rear Admiral C.W. Nimitz, Chief of the Bureau of Navigation. What was so ironic and heartrending about that telegram was that the person who had to deliver that telegram was the person to whom it was addressed, Peter W. Reese. He had to deliver this telegram to himself, telling him his son's dead. His son did not die, and just a short time ago, he was one of those who was in Pearl Harbor for the celebration that was held there. And he received this letter. I don't know if I can do this. I'm going to try. I'm going to see if I can read it to you. This letter from his daughter. This was 50 years later. It says, "Daddy, you were only 20 years old that day. I am picturing you running across the ship to take your post. Around you there are frightened young men running wildly, knowing what to do, not knowing what to do, and dying before they even have a chance to think about it. Do they have time to wonder whether they will be alive tomorrow or tonight or 1 minute from now? Or do they just do what they have to do, taking one moment at a time, saying a silent prayer if they can? I can only imagine what those moments must have been like for you, Daddy. On this day, as you look back 50 years, do not wonder why you were spared. I know why. I've thought about it a lot over the past few days. Your life has been important, and you have given so much to others. You have given life, not to just to me and Steve and Jim, but to two precious little souls named Carson and Spencer. And maybe there are other little lives still waiting their turn. A turn that would not come at all had things been different in 1941. I believe you survived that day for a reason. You survived to fulfill your destiny and to allow others to fulfill their destinies. And you survived to survive again. I'm so proud of you, Daddy. You're very special. Celebrate your life today. I will be celebrating with you. I love you. Signed, Jan. The attack on Pearl Harbor also sounded a clarion call that alarmed an entire nation. It could justly be called an event that changed the course of history and indeed the very face of the globe forever. It awakened a sleeping giant with a jolt that will never, I hope, be forgotten. You know, looking back, it reminds me a little bit of what we've just gone through in the Persian Gulf. And we see a situation where you'll recall that some of those who were the loudest alarmists about that, talking about the huge casualties we were going to suffer, after it was all over, said, no big deal, the Iraqis were not very strong anyway. And looking back at what happened in World War II, I suppose there are some who say, you know, it was never in doubt. We knew we were going to win all along, no problem. Well, ask any of these people sitting over here whether they thought it was in doubt or not at that time. Ironically, perhaps the only one who was sure that it was not in doubt, who was sure that the Americans, the Allies would win, and that the Japanese and the Axis would lose, was the fellow who instituted the attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto. He knew what Americans were all about. He knew what he was getting and what Japan was getting into. You know, 2,330 men and women lost their lives that Sunday morning at Pearl Harbor. You know, sadly and ironically, that number almost exactly matches the MIAs and POWs in Southeast Asia that have not yet to be accounted for. One of the World War II is over, but as far as I'm concerned, and I know all of you in this room share this concern and this emphasis, that until those 2,330 people, some number like that, in Southeast Asia are accounted for, that war should not be considered as over either. Almost 300,000 more died in the years that followed in places with names like Guadalcanal and Bataan and Anzio and Normandy. It united a nation and resulted ultimately in a new world. It took many more years, in fact it is still going on, to sort through the debris of the Cold War that followed. But the ultimate collapse of communism and the flowering of democracy that we've witnessed over the past 2 years are a direct result of the determination and resolve that seized the nation that December morning 50 years ago because of the sacrifices and the gallantry that you all showed on that occasion. And as Edward R. Murrow used to say, you were there. So I was more than honored to support the effort in Congress to design a special medal to honor the survivors of Pearl Harbor. And the large number of you here today makes me feel even more proud and somewhat surprised. I am really surprised at how many were able to be here, and I'm really grateful for that. There's really no way our nation can express its profound gratitude to you for what you did. But I hope that this long-deserved award will serve an equally important function. And that is, as the General said, to remind current and future generations of Americans that eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. Never again can we allow ourselves to sleep complacently while dictators enslave nations. Modern weapons of war give even less time to prepare than we had to prepare against the Japanese and the Germans in World War II. We have to be ready all the time. So on behalf of the United States Congress to which I add my own personal gratitude and respect. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you, Congressman Waszkiewicz. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise. Attention to orders. Citation to accompany the award of the Congressional Medal for Veterans of the Attack on Pearl Harbor. On behalf of the Congress of the United States of America, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the President pro tempore of the Senate, authorize the presentation of the Congressional Medal for Veterans of the Attack on Pearl Harbor to commemorate the sacrifices made by those veterans of the Armed Forces of the United States who defended Pearl Harbor and other military installations in Hawaii against attack by the Japanese on December 7, 1941. This medal, authorized for presentation on the 50th anniversary of that infamous date, is bestowed to honor those veterans who, as certified by the Secretary of Defense, participated in combat operations against Japanese military forces attacking Hawaii that day, as well as to honor those who were wounded and those who made the ultimate sacrifice of their lives in the service of their grateful nation. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Now, Congressman Waszkiewicz will present the Congressional Medal to our first group of survivors of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Mr. Donald Anderson. Mr. Jesse Walker. Mr. George Washburn. Mr. Edward Waszkiewicz. Mr. Walter Wiedenfeller. Mr. Jacob Whitman. To the area in front of the stage, as Congressman Lagomarsino presents the medals to 3 more Pearl Harbor survivors.
People in wheelchairs.
Mr. Virgil Henderson. May we have one collective round of applause for the six. President of the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association for San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, and Ventura Counties. Chapter 4, Mr. Olin Campbell.
Number one, I don't know how you follow a class act like this, but it's great. It is wonderful to see all of them out here this afternoon. I want to say a great big thank you to each and every one of you, because this is a memorable presentation, isn't it? And I want to thank the Honorable Congressman for seeing that this was possible and that he is here personally to present these medals to our men. Thank you, gentlemen. And thank you. I want to thank each and every one of you servicemen that are in the background helping put this off today, and to Captain Walt, who made it go. Without her, I'm afraid I'd been up here with a crippled leg. I want to say thank you to my wife, Mary, who has done a lot of the telephone work because I wasn't around. And that may have been a mistake or two, but together we made it. And that's about the best I can say for that. And I'm sure there has been a few left out. But I do want to say again, thank you to Brigadier General Kenning and Base, our host commander, Colonel Bell. This was a wonderful presentation, and it thrilled my heart, and I know it does each one of you survivors. This is something that we didn't know we deserved, but we have it, and we can say hallelujah to that. Because it does mean a lot to us who put our lives on the line 50 years ago. Today we're still here, and it's great. And because it's almost eating time, and I think of my stomach first, my talking last, I'm going to say thanks again for being here, and thanks to the base, thanks to the base commander and this cohort. Thank you again for being here.
Please remain standing for the retirement of colors. Ladies and gentlemen, it's truly been a privilege for the men and women of Vandenberg Air Force Base to host this very special ceremony. On behalf of the installation commander, Brigadier General Sebastian F. Coglifort, thank you for the honor of your presence. As a reminder, the Vandenberg Officers Club has prepared an outstanding brunch immediately following this ceremony, this program. If you haven't already purchased a ticket, you may do so when you arrive at the club. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our ceremony. Again, thank you for your participation on this historic occasion.